You did not lose your power. You handed it to people who were never worthy of holding it. That sentence is going to sit with you longer than you want it to, because some part of you already knows it is true. You have spent months, maybe years, calling it bad luck, a bad breakup, a bad boss, a bad year. You have built an entire vocabulary around the idea that your life fell apart because the world was unfair to you specifically, as if fairness was ever a variable anyone promised you. It was not. Nobody signed that contract. You are the one who added the clause. Here is the part nobody wants to say out loud in a comfortable voice. Machiavelli did not believe the world rewards the virtuous. He watched virtuous men lose their thrones, their armies, their lives, over and over, because they were busy being good while someone else was busy being prepared. He wrote a manual, cold and exact, about a truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. The world does not reward potential. It rewards power, and power is not handed out to whoever deserves it most. It is taken by whoever positioned himself to take it. So, before you keep telling yourself the story where you are the victim of circumstance, sit with a harder question. What if your collapse was never proof that life was cruel to you? What if it was proof that you had not yet learned how to lead yourself? By the end of this, you are going to understand exactly which half of your ruin was actually yours. Not the half you could not control, the half you were negligent about. And once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it, because it changes what rock bottom actually means. It stops being a verdict on who you are. It becomes a position on a map, one you chose to stand in, whether you noticed choosing it or not. Let us start with the lie you have been told is comforting. The world loves to tell you that you are going through a hard time. Notice the phrasing. Going through, as if it is weather, as if you are a passenger standing at a window watching circumstances rain down on you, and all you can do is wait for the storm to pass and dry off afterward. It is a soft phrase. It removes you from the equation entirely, and it feels good to hear, because it means none of this is your fault. Machiavelli would have found that phrase almost insulting to your intelligence. He drew a hard line between two forces that govern every human outcome. He called one of them fortuna, chance, circumstance, the stuff that happens to you regardless of what you do, who your parents were when the recession hit, who broke your trust first. The other he called virtù, not virtue in the moral sense. Virtù is capacity, skill, timing, the muscle of preparedness that determines whether you can act decisively when fortune finally opens a door or slams one shut in your face. He estimated that fortune controls roughly half of what happens to a man. The other half, he said, remains in human hands, governed by foresight and readiness. Half. Not all of it. Half. Picture two people standing in the exact same wreckage. Same layoff, same email, same Friday afternoon, walk out of the building with a cardboard box under one arm. Person one spends the next 6 months telling anyone who will listen that the company betrayed them. The economy is rigged, the industry is dying, and none of this was survivable. Person two spends that same 6 months quietly auditing something uncomfortable. What skills had they let go soft? What savings had they failed to build? What relationships had they neglected to maintain that could have opened a door somewhere else? Both of them experienced the same fortuna. Only one of them had virtue sitting in reserve. Here is the part that stings. The wreckage was not the failure. The unpreparedness was the failure. Fortune did what fortune does, indifferent and untimed. But virtue is not indifferent. Virtue is the part of the story that was always yours to build. quietly in the months and years before the storm ever arrived. And if you did not build it, the storm does not owe you an apology for finding you empty-handed. This is where most self-help content stops, because it is more comfortable to stop here. It tells you that you are enough, exactly as you are, and that the universe will realign once you believe it hard enough. Machiavelli never said you were enough. He never once wrote a line resembling comfort. What he said, in essence, was colder and far more useful. You are unprepared, and unpreparedness is not a permanent condition. It is a solvable one. There is no ledger in the universe correcting for your good intentions. There is only the gap between what fortune throws at you and what you built the capacity to meet it with. So ask yourself honestly, not gently. If half of what happened to you was outside your hands, fine. That half was never yours to carry guilt over. But which half did you actually neglect? Which door opened at some point in the last few years that you were simply not built to walk through? Sit with that question, because we are about to show you exactly what happens to a man who inherits a kingdom he never prepared to defend. There is an old political problem that Machiavelli returns to again and again, because it is the sharpest illustration of what happens when someone tries to build something new using the wreckage of something old. Picture a new prince taking control of a territory that used to belong to someone else. He has the throne now, he has the title, but the court around him, the advisors, the guards, the household staff, all of them were loyal to the previous ruler. They remember the old order. They still, quietly, orient themselves around it. And Machiavelli's observation is brutal in its simplicity. A new prince who tries to rule through an inherited court without first clearing it will not survive long. The old loyalties do not fade on their own. They have to be removed deliberately before anything new can be built on that ground. Now look at your own collapse through that lens instead of through the lens of tragedy. When your life fell apart, whatever that looked like for you, it did not just take something from you. It cleared a court, the friendships that only worked because you were the version of yourself who tolerated being used. The daily habits that only made sense inside a life that no longer exists. The self-image you had been quietly performing for people who are no longer in the room to perform it for. All of it got cleared out, violently, and without your consent. The same way a new prince inherits a throne, standing on top of a court, still loyal to a dead king. Here is what almost nobody tells you about that clearing. It was necessary, not deserved, not fair, not something you should be grateful for in some forced, saccharine way. Necessary. Because you cannot build a new order, a new version of how you operate, a new standard for what you allow near you, while the old court is still sitting in the room, still advising you, still expecting you to answer to loyalties that no longer serve the version of you that needs to exist next. This is where you need to separate two things that get confused constantly. There is a nihilistic version of destruction, the kind that shows up in certain corners of self-improvement content, that treats burning everything down as an aesthetic. Cut everyone off, trust no one, walk alone forever. That is not what is being described here. And it is not what Machiavelli was describing either. His version of clearing the court was never chaos for its own sake. It was targeted, it was time-limited, it had a purpose on the other side of it, which was consolidation of a stable new order, not permanent isolation as some kind of trophy, demolition with blueprints, not demolition as a personality. The mistake most people make after collapse is resisting the clearing, instead of finishing it. They try to keep pieces of the old court around because letting go feels like losing something twice. They keep the friend who only shows up during the chaos. They keep the habit that only made sense under the old identity. They leave one advisor from the previous regime sitting quietly in the corner of the new one. And then they wonder, months later, why the new version of themselves keeps getting undermined by a voice that was never loyal to it in the first place. Clearing the court is not the tragedy. Leaving it half cleared is. Something worth sitting with here, separate from the specific mechanics of any one lesson. Notice how differently this feels from the self-help content you are used to. Most of it is built to console you during collapse. It wants you to feel less alone in the wreckage, and there is a place for that. But comfort and utility are not the same tool, and they are not aimed at the same outcome. Comfort keeps you company inside the rubble. It does not hand you a blueprint. It says, "I see that you are hurting," and stops there, as if the hurting is the whole story. Machiavelli was never interested in consoling anyone. He was interested in what a person does with the wreckage once the sympathy runs out. Because sympathy runs out every time, and utility is the only thing left standing afterward. Comfort keeps you in the rubble a little longer because it feels less lonely there. Utility gets you out because it gives you something to do with your hands. Which brings us to the part of this most people get wrong. Even when they do manage to clear their court, they clear it. And then they immediately hand the new throne over to the same thing that got them into trouble in the first place. Their own untrained reactions. Watch how most people respond to a slight. Someone says something cutting in a group chat, or a colleague takes credit for their work in a meeting, or a partner says something quietly cruel during an argument. The reaction is instant, a sharp reply, a defensive explanation, a visible flinch that the whole room can read. It feels like strength in the moment because it feels like standing up for yourself. It is not strength. It is a transaction, and the other person just cashed it in for free. Now watch a different kind of person absorb the exact same slight. Nothing on the surface. No immediate reply. They log it, mentally. The way an advisor logs which member of court cannot be trusted with sensitive information, and they say nothing, not because they did not notice, not because it did not land, but because they have not yet decided whether this moment is worth spending anything on. Machiavelli's princes survive specifically because they read situations before reacting to them. They treat information the way a strategist treats intelligence. Something to be gathered quietly and used at the correct time, not detonated the instant it arrives. This is not suppression, and it is important you do not mistake it for that, because suppression is a trap of its own. Machiavelli never said, "Do not feel the sting of betrayal or disrespect." He said, "Do not spend the feeling where it earns you nothing." There is a difference between swallowing an emotion until it rots inside you and simply declining to hand someone the satisfaction of watching it land in real time. One of those is self-harm dressed up as discipline. The other is patience with teeth. You have probably heard some version of the 24-hour rule before, the advice to wait a day before responding to something that upset you. Most people frame it as a calming technique, something to lower your heart rate before you fire off a text you will regret. That framing is too soft for what is actually happening. The wait is not about calming down. It is intelligence gathering. Every hour you do not react is an hour you spend learning something new about the person who provoked you. whether they escalate when they get no response, whether they backtrack, whether they reveal, in the silence, exactly how much they were counting on your predictability. Delay is not self-control for its own sake. It is a strategic position, and the person who breaks first hands over information they did not mean to give away. Once you actually start living this way, once you stop reacting on contact and start observing instead, something uncomfortable starts to surface. You begin noticing how many people around you were never being fully honest with you either, not necessarily lying outright, just quietly managing you, the same way you used to quietly manage your own reactions, except they were doing it on purpose. And you were the only one in the room who did not know the game was being played. Start with the people who are still in your court right now, because that inherited court from before is not fully gone. Just because you noticed the old loyalties, it rebuilt itself. It always does quietly while you were busy healing, and most of it rebuilt around the same soft advice everyone gives you. Cut out toxic people. It is repeated so often it has become furniture. Nobody explains what it means, and nobody tells you how to actually apply it. So it just sits there as a vague slogan you nod at and never use. Machiavelli was far more specific about the danger, and it was not really about enemies at all. He believed the court itself, the people physically closest to the prince, posed a greater threat to his rule than any army outside the walls. An enemy at the gates announces himself. He is easy to identify, easy to prepare for. The danger inside the court is quieter. It has access. It has your ear. It smiles at your successes in public and, in private, benefits from your failures far more than it ever benefits from your growth. Picture the advisor who has been with you the longest. The friend who always seems to have time for you exactly when you are struggling, and mysteriously less time the moment things start going well. You have probably met this person. They frame your stagnation as loyalty. They frame your ambition as betrayal. If you start waking up earlier, they call you obsessed. If you start setting boundaries, they call you cold. None of this is necessarily conscious on their part. That is what makes it dangerous. They are not villains twirling a mustache in the corner. They are simply people whose position in your life depends on you staying exactly where you are, and some part of them can feel your growth as a threat to their own relevance, long before either of you can name it out loud. An audit is not about villainizing these people, and it is not a purity test to see who deserves to stay in your life based on how much they like the new version of you. It is about mapping incentives, coldly, the way you would map anything else that determines outcomes. Who benefits from the weak version of you? Who benefits from the strong one? Those are frequently not the same people, and pretending otherwise is how you end up handing your new throne over to your old court, without even noticing the transfer of power. Here is the distinction that matters most, and it is the one people flinch away from, because it sounds harsher than it actually is. Access is not the same thing as affection. You can love someone completely and still not owe them unrestricted access to your time, your plans, your vulnerable moments, or your next move. A border is not a wall built out of resentment. It is a checkpoint. And checkpoints exist precisely because you are willing to let people in, not because you are trying to keep everyone out. An open-door policy sounds generous until you notice that everyone who has ever taken advantage of you walked through the same door the people who genuinely support you did. The problem was never having a door. The problem was never checking who was walking through it. This is where most people flinch, because auditing your court does not mean auditing strangers. It means auditing people you love. It means sitting with the possibility that someone who has been kind to you for years is still, structurally, incentivized by your smallness. You do not have to burn the relationship down. You simply have to stop granting unrestricted access to a person whose comfort depends on your stagnation, and watch carefully what they do once that access is no longer free. There is a pattern worth naming plainly here, because it explains almost every version of this dynamic you will encounter for the rest of your life. People rarely resent your boundaries in proportion to how much those boundaries actually cost them. They resent your boundaries in proportion to how much unrestricted access they used to have. The friend who reacts the most violently to your new limits is very often the friend who benefited the most from you having none. That is not a coincidence, and it is not paranoia to notice it. It is simply what happens when a border finally gets built around territory that used to be open for anyone to walk through. Now, take that same cold, unsentimental clarity and turn it toward the wound itself, because auditing your court only closes half the exposure. The other half is what already happened to you, the specific betrayal, the specific loss, the version of the story you keep replaying at 2 in the morning, without ever quite finishing it. The world tells you to let it go. Forgive and move on, as if forgiveness were a light switch. As if moving on were a decision you could simply make once and never revisit. This advice sounds spiritual. It is actually a bypass, a way of skipping the only part of the process that produces anything useful. Machiavelli did not study defeat because he wanted to feel better about losing. He studied it because defeat contains information nowhere else is willing to give you for free. Every betrayal, every collapse, every moment someone you trusted proved unworthy of that trust, is a battlefield loss with a specific cause. Something was exposed. A blind spot, a misplaced trust, a pattern you did not yet have the vocabulary to name. The point was never to relive the loss for the sake of reliving it. The point was to extract the operational intelligence sitting inside it and then close the door on the raw version of the memory for good. This is the difference between rumination and transmutation, and it is a difference almost nobody draws clearly enough. Rumination replays the pain on a loop, over and over, without ever extracting anything new from it. Same footage, same ending, same fresh wave of humiliation or grief each time it plays, and nothing to show for the replay except exhaustion. Transmutation is deliberate. It replays the pain once on purpose, specifically to ask a colder question than the one's grief usually asks. Not why did this happen to me? What vulnerability did this expose? What did I fail to check, verify, or prepare for that let this land as hard as it did? Think of it the way a soldier thinks about armor. Nobody builds armor to guarantee they are never hit again. That is not how armor works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a fantasy. Armor is built from knowing exactly where you got hit last time, the gap in the plating, the angle nobody thought to cover. You do not build it in the abstract, hoping it covers everything. You build it specifically from the wound, because the wound is the only reliable map of where you were actually exposed. That is the entire function of pain, if you are willing to use it correctly. Not something to be endured until it fades. Not something to be transcended through positive thinking. Material, raw material, sitting there whether you use it or not, and the only real choice you have is whether you extract something from it or let it rot unused. But knowing exactly where you are vulnerable is not the same as being ready to rebuild, and this is where people move too fast. The moment they identify the gap in their armor, they want to announce the rebuild immediately, publicly, as if narrating the reconstruction is the same thing as completing it. Watch what urgency does to people. The culture around you insists you are behind, that you need to catch up immediately, that every day spent quietly working instead of visibly performing progress is a day wasted. Machiavelli would have found this obsession with speed almost naive. He wrote about timing as one of the defining differences between princes who kept their power and princes who lost it within a year of gaining it. A prince who moves before the moment is ripe, who forces an outcome before the conditions actually support it, frequently loses more than a prince who simply waited and moved once the terrain was actually in his favor. Picture the person who announces their transformation the moment they decide to start it. New routine, new mindset, new version of themselves, all declared publicly before any of it has been tested under pressure. There is a reason this so often collapses within weeks. The announcement invites an audience, and an audience invites two things that unfinished work cannot survive: premature judgment and interference from people whose incentives, as established, may not actually favor your growth. Compare that to the person who says nothing, who simply becomes harder to reach, harder to predict, and lets the results speak once there is something worth showing. Nobody got the chance to sabotage what they never knew was happening. This is not secrecy for the sake of secrecy. It is protection for an unfinished asset. Think about the parts of a plant that matter most and are the least visible. Root growth happens entirely underground, in the dark, with nothing to show for it above the surface for a long time. It is unglamorous. Nobody applauds a root system. But root growth is the only thing determining whether the visible growth, the part everyone eventually sees and admires, survives the first real storm that comes through. A tree with a shallow, showy root system looks identical to a tree with a deep one, right up until the wind actually tests it. Silent building only works, though, if you are also willing to become genuinely unavailable. And this is the part most people quietly resist, even after they understand it intellectually. Watch what happens to the person who is endlessly available. They answer every message within minutes, agree to nearly every request, show up whenever they are called, and somewhere underneath all of that responsiveness is an assumption they never examined. That being constantly accessible would eventually be rewarded with respect. It rarely is. People do not calibrate their treatment of you based on how generous you are with your time. They calibrate it based on how scarce your time appears to be, and generosity that never runs out simply stops registering as generosity at all. It becomes the baseline, the floor, something owed rather than something given. Now watch the other version. Someone whose time is visibly limited, who does not respond instantly, who is not available on demand. And notice what happens around them instead. People plan around their schedule rather than expecting them to plan around everyone else's. Their opinions get weighed more carefully, not because the opinions themselves changed, but because access to them costs something now. This is not about being difficult for its own sake, and it is not manipulation dressed up as mystery. It is closer to basic economics. Anything distributed without limit loses value, regardless of how good it actually is, and that includes you. Machiavelli's answer to whether it is better to be loved or feared runs directly through this same principle, and it surprises people every time they actually read it, instead of just hearing the summary second-hand. He did not say fear alone. He said, fear is more reliable than love, because love depends on the other person's goodwill, which can evaporate the instant it becomes inconvenient for them, while fear, or in this context something closer to respect built through consequence, does not depend on anyone else's mood. Translate that out of the language of armies and courts, and into the language of your own relationships. Being liked is fragile. It bends to other people's convenience. Being respected is sturdier, because it is built on consequence, on the demonstrated fact that you do not tolerate being taken for granted, rather than on the hope that people will simply choose to treat you well out of the goodness of their own inclination. This is not an argument for coldness as a personality. It is an argument for controlling access to something valuable, rather than distributing it freely until it stops being valuable at all. There is a simple, almost embarrassingly practical rule buried inside this dynamic. Notice, in your own life, who is consistently the first to reply, the first to apologize, the first to reach back out after a silence. That person is very rarely the one being taken for granted. It is almost always the opposite. The last person to respond, the one whose silence costs the other party more than their own silence costs them, is the one holding the actual leverage in the exchange, whether either of them would ever describe it in those terms out loud. Once people around you can no longer take you for granted, though a different and more uncomfortable problem tends to surface, and it is worth naming honestly rather than skipping past. Most people confuse being liked with being respected, as if the two always travel together, and Machiavelli's insight cuts directly against that assumption. Sometimes they trade off against each other. The version of you that makes decisions, holds boundaries, and controls its own access will occasionally be less liked in the moment than the version of you that said yes to everything and asked for nothing. That is not a flaw in the strategy. It is the cost of it, and pretending the cost does not exist is how people talk themselves out of holding the boundary the very first time it gets tested. The version of you that is loved unconditionally, by absolutely everyone, without exception, is very often the version making no real decisions at all, because decisions, by definition, disappoint someone. Which brings us to the piece almost every self-improvement video gets backwards, the one about vision. You have heard it 1,000 times. Chase your passion, manifest your future, get crystal clear on your vision, and the universe will rearrange itself to meet you there. It sounds inspiring. It is also, in Machiavelli's framework, almost entirely beside the point, and understanding why changes how you should be spending your actual time. Machiavelli described fortune as something closer to a river than a judge. A river does not reward or punish anyone. It simply flows, and when it floods, it overwhelms whatever was left unprepared for it, while the people who spent the dry season building dams and channels are able to direct that same flood towards something useful. Boldness without preparation in this framework is not courage. It is exposure dressed up as confidence, standing in the floodplain with your arms open, calling it faith. Picture two people encountering the exact same opportunity at the exact same moment. Same job opening, same investor meeting, same chance introduction at the exact right time. One of them has spent the last 2 years quietly building capacity. Nobody was watching. Skills sharpened in private. relationships maintained without any immediate payoff, savings set aside with no specific goal attached to them yet. The other has spent those same 2 years building enthusiasm, a vision board, a clear mental picture of the life they want, passion in abundance. When the opportunity actually arrives, only one of them can act on it, and it is never the one who merely wanted it more. Vision without infrastructure is not vision at all. It is wanting, dressed in more articulate language. Machiavelli's version of vision looks almost nothing like a vision board. It looks closer to engineering. You do not fall in love with a destination and wait for the universe to deliver you there. You build the capacity to move through whichever door actually opens, because you rarely get to choose which door that will be. And the people who spent years falling in love with one specific outcome are frequently the ones left standing outside a door they never trained themselves to walk through. This does not mean boldness is worthless. Machiavelli genuinely admired bold action and said so directly, but only as the final move after preparation, the decisive strike once the terrain has already been mapped and the capacity already exists to exploit it. Confusing the two, treating boldness as a substitute for preparation rather than the last step built on top of it, is precisely why so much of that advice fails the people who follow it most sincerely. They mistake the leap for the training and wonder why the leap did not hold their weight. Notice something about why this kind of advice stays so popular despite how rarely it produces results. Talking about your future self is free. It costs nothing, feels good in the moment, and requires no accountability, because nobody can prove you failed at a vision that was never specific enough to fail. Building the actual conditions for that future is expensive. It costs time, discomfort, and the willingness to work on something invisible for months before it produces anything worth showing anyone. People consistently choose the free version, the vision board, over the infrastructure, not because they are lazy, but because one option flatters the ego and the other one demands something from it. This is also, quietly, why the loudest person in any given room is rarely the most dangerous one. Loudness is a form of premature announcement, the same mistake as declaring a transformation before it has survived any real pressure. The person actually worth watching is usually the one who has said the least, asked the fewest questions, and revealed almost nothing about what they are actually building. Silence, at this level, is not passivity. It is the last visible sign of someone who has already learned every lesson covered so far and has nothing left to prove out loud. Everything up to this point, the court audit, the pain transmuted into armor, the silent building, the controlled access, none of it was ever a separate piece of advice standing on its own. It is one system, and removing any single piece collapses the rest. Patience without boundaries just becomes passivity, waiting quietly, while people who were never incentivized by your growth continue to drain you unchecked. Boundaries without preparation just becomes isolation, cutting off access to people, while having nothing built yet to fill the space that access used to occupy. Each piece only works because the others are holding it in place, the same way a court only stays cleared if the timing is respected, and the timing only matters if there is actually something worth protecting while it develops. Which finally brings us to the last thing standing between you and any of this actually taking hold. The old version of yourself, still technically alive, still technically available, still sitting exactly where you left it. The culture around you loves the phrase "New Year," new me, because it is designed to be temporary. It is a costume, put on with enthusiasm every January and quietly discarded by March, because nothing about it demanded the old identity actually die. It was always just a phase, a diet, with a relapse built into its very design, a performance staged for an audience that stopped watching after the first few weeks. Machiavelli's successful princes did something categorically different when they founded a new order. They treated the old one as genuinely finished, not paused, not on hold pending a better mood, finished, the way a dead ruler is finished, with no path back to the throne and no ambiguity left about who is in charge now. This is the difference between temporary reinvention, which is motivated by inspiration and therefore collapses the instant inspiration runs out, and permanent identity termination, which is decided once and does not require daily motivation to sustain it, because there is no old self left standing to retreat back into. This is where burial only works if you actually finished the earlier steps, instead of skipping to this one, hoping it would work on its own. You cannot bury a version of yourself while its old court is still fully staffed, still offering advice, still expecting loyalty. You cannot bury it while you are still building loudly instead of silently, handing the unfinished version of your new self over to an audience who will judge it before it is ready to be judged. Burial requires removing the option to return, not just the desire to. Most people remove the desire and call it transformation, then wonder months later why the old self was still so easy to slip back into the moment things got difficult. The option was never actually closed. Only the mood was. Machiavelli treated the founding of a new order as something close to an act of violence against the old one, not because he enjoyed cruelty, but because he understood that half measures satisfy nobody. A prince who keeps 1 foot in the old regime and 1 foot in the new one is trusted by neither. He is not respected by the people loyal to what came before, because he abandoned it. He is not fully trusted by the people building what comes next, because he never fully let go of what came before. Halfway reinvention is the least stable position available, and it is, not coincidentally, the position most people accidentally choose, because it is the only one that never requires them to fully commit. Which brings this back to a version of you that might still be sitting somewhere in this exact moment, quietly deciding whether any of this actually applies to them personally, or whether it was simply an interesting way to spend the last several minutes. You were never unlucky. That is the sentence this entire thing has been circling since the very beginning, and now you have the vocabulary to actually understand it, instead of just feeling it. Fortune took its half, indifferent and untimed, the same way it takes something from everyone eventually. But you were unprepared, unguarded, and unwilling for a long time to bury the version of yourself that fortune had already outgrown long before you were ready to admit it. That was never bad luck. That was negligence, and negligence, unlike luck, is something you were always capable of correcting. Go back to the very beginning of this. Which half did you neglect? Now you know. It was virtue. The part that was always sitting in your own hands, the preparation nobody was going to build for you while you waited for fortune to apologize for something it was never obligated to explain. Sovereignty was never a mood. It is not something you wake up feeling on a good morning and lose on a bad one. It is a structure, built piece by piece, the same way every section of this was built on the one before it, a court that has actually been audited. Silence protected long enough to let something real finish developing underneath it. Timing respected instead of rushed for the sake of an audience. An old self buried with no return path left open, not out of hatred for who you used to be, but because that version already did everything it was capable of doing, and asking it to keep going would only slow down the version that comes next. So, here is the question worth sitting with long after this ends. What is the one access point you are still too afraid to close? Not the obvious one, the quiet one, the one you have been justifying for months, because closing it would mean admitting something about who benefited from you staying small. You know which one it is already. Comment it, or comment the words, "I am building in silence and mean it," because saying it publicly here costs you nothing, and living it privately from this point forward is the only part that was ever going to matter.